I'll be demonstrating Brioche Stitch in a single color, worked flat with a Selvedge edge. This will work on any odd number of stitches. I've cast on 15. We just want to make sure that they're a little bit loose on your needle because the fabric is going to widen quite a bit and we want the edge to widen with it. I'm going to start this with the yarn in my right hand and I'll switch to yarn in my left hand after a couple of rows. So for our setup row, I'm going to slip one stitch purlwise with the yarn in back, so my needle's in front of my yarn, go in purlwise and just move it over. And then I'm going to start my repeat where my asterisk is. Bring the yarn to the front. I'm going to slip a stitch with a yarn over. So I'm going to put my needle in as if I'm purling, but I'm just going to move it over. And I'm actually just going to leave the yarn where it is. And as I do my next thing, which is a knit one, this yarn is going to wrap over the top of the needle. That's that YO in the pattern. So that's my repeat. Here's my selvage stitch. My repeat gives me this kind of crisscross stitch and then a plain one. So yarn to the front, I'm going to slip a stitch purlwise, and I'll leave my yarn where it is so that as I do my knit one next, the yarn naturally wraps over the right hand needle here. And again, yarn to the front, slip one purlwise, we don't want to twist it, leave the yarn right where it is, and let her wrap over the front as I do my knit one. Repeat again, yarn to the front, slip one purlwise, the yarn will wrap over the needle naturally as I do my knit one. So although I bring the yarn to the front, I never bring it to the back. I let it go over the needle as it goes to the back again. And as I get to the end of the row, I'm going to keep my repeat going all the way to the end of the row, so 2 stitches remaining. Yarn to the front, slip one purlwise, the yarn will wrap over the needle as I do my knit one. So now, I still have my same 15 stitches, but they look a little different. So every other stitch looks like this, where it looks, sometimes it's described as a stitch with a shawl over its shoulders, but it's my slip stitch kind of crossed over by my yarn over. That is perfect, that's what I want. I'm going to count that as 1 if I'm counting, so if I count now, I would still get 15 stitches, even though I've got more than 15 strands of yarn on the needle. Now we're going to get into our row that we're going to be a right side row, row 1. And we here are going to start with, just like before, slipping one purlwise with the yarn in back. Now I'm here at one of my crisscross stitches and I'm going to do a Brioche Knit, which is abbreviated, excuse me, BRK, or sometimes we call it a bark stitch. So I'm going to go into both those strands that are crossed and knit it, make sure I come out, leaving just one stitch on my needle, and there we go. So again, that's called a Brioche Knit or a bark stitch. Now I'm going to bring the yarn to the front, slip a stitch, leave the yarn right where it is so it'll go over the top of the needle naturally as I do my next stitch, and we're repeating. This is going to be a Brioche Knit, where I go into both strands at once. Yarn to the front, slip a stitch purlwise, and then Brioche Knit, allowing the yarn to wrap over the needle here as I do. Yarn to the front, slip my knit stitch purlwise, leave the yarn where it is, so it'll wrap over my needle as I Brioche Knit. So it's a lot like the last row. The difference is instead of plain knits, I'm doing Brioche Knits because I have to, because I've got these funny little cross stitches here. Yarn to the front, slip one, Brioche Knit. Yarn to the front, slip one, Brioche Knit. And at the very last stitch, I'm going to just knit one here at the very end. Alright, so again, every other stitch has that kind of crisscross look to it, but I have 2 plain looking stitches at the beginning and 2 plain looking stitches at the other end. Now I'm going to do row 2. It's almost the same, but the difference is that selvage stitch, and I'm going to switch to having the yarn in my left hand here. So I'm going to start with slipping one purlwise with the yarn at the back, so same start as all the rows. And then I'm going to bring the yarn to the front, and I'm going to do that same slip one yarn over. It looks a little different with the yarn on the left here, so I'm going to come in as if I was purling, including having the yarn wrap around the needle here, and then I'm going to take that old stitch off to slip it, so the yarn is already wrapped around the right hand needle. Now I'm going to do my Brioche Knit, where I go into these 2 strands at once. And again, yarn to the front, going like I'm purling, make sure that the working yarn is on top of your right needle here too. Slide it off so you've already got those cross strands, and then Brioche Knit. And we repeat, yarn to the front, slip one purlwise, the yarn going over the needle, brioche knit. Yarn to the front, slip one purlwise with the yarn going over the needle, brioche knit. And keep doing this till I get to the last 2 stitches. And again, it's just like the previous row except for the very beginning and very end, but the middle is going to be the same repeats. So here I am into my last 2 stitches. I'm going to bring the yarn to the front and slip this one with the yarn going over the needle, and I'm just going to do a plain knit at the end. So for our selvage, every row starts with a slipping one purlwise with the yarn at back, every row ends with knit one. There might be an extra stitch outside of the repeat in there as well. So now I'm back to repeating row 1. I'll keep the yarn in my left hand here. So repeating row 1, we start with slipping one purlwise with the yarn and back. Then I do a brioche knit. And this starts to get obvious because I've got these cross strands. I need to brioche knit them to put them together. I don't want to slip them again and put another yarn over on top of this one. Would be a little wacky. So there's my brioche knit. Yarn to the front, slip that stitch, keeping the yarn over the needle here. Brioche knit, yarn to the front, slip that stitch, brioche knit. I'll switch hands again at the end of the next row. And I'm switching hands just to demonstrate for people who knit in different styles. You don't need to switch hands, you just want to follow whichever one you know how to do, whichever one you prefer if you know both. Now here as I get to the end of row 1, I'm going to brioche knit the second to the last stitch and end with a plain knit one on the last stitch. Now you'll notice this doesn't look so great yet. Because brioche stitch is so lofty and thick, it needs a little breathing room. So I'm going to need to do a couple more rows before it looks like what it's supposed to look like. So back to holding the yarn in my right hand, so people who do that can follow along. This is row 2. I'm going to slip one purlwise with the yarn and back. Yarn to the front, slip one purlwise. I'll let the yarn wrap over the needle as I brioche knit. So there's no need to move it because it's really the same place. Just know that you don't want to move it to the other side like you might do before normal knit. Yarn to the front, slip one, leave the yarn where it is, brioche knit. Yarn to the front, slip one, brioche knit. Now you might start following this by eye. When you've got a single strand for a stitch, that's when the yarn needs to come to the front and you slip that strand, letting the yarn wrap over it. When you've got these cross stitches, that's when you brioche knit. It's fine to keep track based on the row number for a while, but if it starts being something you follow visually, that's really lovely too. I find it goes a little faster and I'm less likely to make mistakes if I can see what it's supposed to look like. Here at the end, I'm going to bring the yarn to the front. I'm going to slip that last stitch. The yarn will wrap over the needle as I do my knit stitch. And we repeat. Now, if you're nervous about it not looking great yet, if you kind of bring it onto your cord, if you're on a circular needle like this, and give a little wiggle, you'll start to be able to see the pattern a little bit. I'm going to speed up just a bit. We'll go back to having it in my left hand because that's faster for me, and get a few more rows just so you can see what it looks like. So slip one, purlwise the yarn and back, brioche knit, yarn to the front, slip one, yarns over the needle, brioche knit, yarn to the front, slip one, brioche knit. This is a really interesting stitch because it's very similar to but different than a knit one, purl one, rib, and you get a really lovely thick, dense, sorry, not dense, thick, lofty, squishy fabric. So even though it's thick, it's got a lot of air in there, so it doesn't feel dense or heavy. You do want to be careful at mixing it with other patterns though, because they can be a really different stitch to row gauge ratio. So here I am, I'm going to do my brioche knit, row knit. And now that I am more rows in, now you can really start seeing this pattern showing up. So it's got really nice thick depth to it, but it's not dense at all. There's still lots of air kind of poking through. So that's the pattern, and you just keep going until it's long enough. When you bind off, you want to bind off loosely, and I would probably bind off in a knit purl stitch pattern, or I would do a sewn bind off, also called a back stitch bind off, to keep that elasticity. All right, have fun.